gentlemen, welcome back at the World AI Show. And right now we are on our Fireside Chat. Firstly, we hope you all had a great time networking with one another. Also, do keep checking my chats as the conference progresses, because that's a great way to stay in touch with one another. Well, we're right now on a Fireside Chat on ethical AI, using AI with good intention to empower employees and businesses. What are the ethical concerns around AI, setting up interdisciplinary teams and center of excellence, and the training models and metrics are going to be the key subtopics we're looking at covering. Well, for this, we've got our speaker, Vijay Jairaj, Head CFCC Data Management Risk, Responsible AI, Standard Chartered Bank. Well, within a background in the engineering and finance, Vijay has worked in the data space in different capacities across countries and industries, building data warehouses and setting up reference data capabilities, amongst other things. Thank you so much, Vijay, for joining us today.
Thank you, Bhavna.
And also,
Go on.
And also joining on the stage and screen now is going to be the moderator of this session, Colin, Christie, the president of the Board of Trustees, Analytics Association of Philippines. Well, Colin is an international executive, serial entrepreneur, global connector, educator, and digital lender. He's been doing business in Philippines for over 2 decades and earned his degree in chemical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining us today and being the moderator of this Fireside Chat.
Bhavana, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting us to the World AI and RPA show, and looking forward to my discussion with Vijay.
Absolutely, and you know, the smile says it all, the energy says it all, though we couldn't have it in a physical format, but I'm sure the virtual format is going to do fantastic right now. So kudos to both of you. Congratulations, and over to you.
Well, excellent. So Vijay, I love this format, this Fireside Chat format, because it does even feel warm. And as Bhavana was just saying, you know, we're meeting virtually, and so it's nice to, you know, kind of at least imagine that we're sitting around the fire having this discussion. You know, Vijay, I think this topic has even been elevated in relevance just in the last 24 hours here in the Philippines, this topic of ethics in AI. Just yesterday morning, our National Privacy Commission issued a joint press statement with the FinTech Alliance and the Philippine Finance Association, condemning certain data practices by certain companies that are gathering information about their users on lending apps, including accessing their photo albums and other sort of information, presumably to use in their AI algorithms on creditworthiness. So, you know, I think this topic is very much in the forefront, but let me turn it to you first, just for an intro. Just kind of give us, paint the broad strokes here on the topic for us, Vijay.
Sure, Colin, thank you for that. And you're right, it is topical. And one of the questions that keep cropping up in my discussions on this topic is, why is ethical AI a big deal? Ethical concepts in business are not new. And the reasoning goes that AI is just another technology or another technique. So what's the big deal about ethical AI? And the answer to that lies in how AI is fundamentally different from other technologies. So historically, you had subject matter experts that gave you the so-called requirements or the business rules that drove system behavior. And then the technology guys went away, coded it, and the systems worked. With AI, it's different. As you all know, it learns those business rules from historical data. And therein lie two drivers of risk, as I call it. One is you're dependent on your data. You're as good as your data is, and that data may reflect real world bias. That data may not be representative of the demographic that you wish to target. And the second thing is the rules that it learns. You don't know what it's actually learning. In most cases, AI models tend to be black boxes. You don't have visibility into those rules. And when things go wrong, or let us say a credit application is rejected or a CV is rejected, and the regulators ask you, why did that happen? The computer said no is not a good question. So that's where it becomes an extremely important and topical area, not just to talk about, but to actually act on. Very briefly, quite a few examples around in the industry. The ones you referred to, Colin, come to mind. A popular one is Amazon using an AI-based system for screening CVs for technology roles that turned out to be gender biased. It was rejecting women's CVs automatically. It was all over the press, and they scrapped the system after trying to fix it for a couple of years. So you have financial and reputational impact from AI going wrong. So as Colin said, topical, important, and something to act upon.
Yes, indeed. You know, Vijay, whenever I am asked to moderate a discussion like this, I always like to even just go back to the dictionary and understand at the very core, are we all aligned in understanding of words that we use in everyday conversations? We talk about this AI ethics. So I actually looked it up, you know, what is the definition of ethics? And it says moral principles that govern a person's behavior or conducting of an activity. And so I think it's an interesting one here, because I think oftentimes we're not thinking about technology and topics under the umbrella of digital transformation being based on moral principles and, you know, behavioral elements. And, you know, I studied engineering, was mentioned earlier, and I think it was usually those folks taking liberal arts that took the ethics courses, and we engineers, you know, we were all about the math and the science. And so I'm just wondering, you know, as you continue to sort of scope out here this the importance of AI, what are your thoughts on that? How do we make this a topic of importance, even amongst, you know, the engineering set that are building the AI systems?
There is no simple answer to that, Colin. It requires a multidisciplinary effort, and it is something we are seeing at the bank as well. So you have historically, like you described, engineers and even data scientists, their focus is more on the models being accurate and less on the impact of the models on the people that they're designed to serve. So you could come up with a model that was extremely accurate in predicting whether a person would meet a particular job requirement. However, if you had trained it exclusively with male CVs and not with female CVs, accurate algorithm, but you're going to have a lot of real world impact. So you're not going to be selecting women CVs, for example, which I believe is what happened in the use case of Amazon. So you need engineers, data scientists, and people in the development space being trained, being made aware of, being sensitized to real world practical considerations around ethics and to the impact of the work they are doing on their stakeholders. They need to be aware of input features. The data that I'm using for my model, is it representative of the people that it is supposed to serve? Do I have enough? If you're developing a facial recognition model, do you have enough training data from various ethnicities? Because that's a huge source of inaccuracy in facial recognition. And it's not just about the algorithm of the model, it's also about the data, and most importantly, about the outcomes of your AI. So I hope that answers your question adequately.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I really like the way you framed this in terms of, you know, inputs and outputs. I think that's something we engineers can relate to, you know, these ideas of models, inputs and outputs. You know, I think from my understanding, you know, AI ethics, it's really about developing the techniques and the principles that inform the development of AI. So I think, you know, if we break this down, perhaps we could drill down a little bit now on this. How does one go about applying good principles and techniques? You know, let's tackle the input side first. What are some of the considerations that come to play in making sure that you don't have bias built in just because of the source of your inputs?
Yeah, a good question. And let me step back and take an organization-wide look at it before we drill down into the actual development
Certainly.
aspects. Most large organizations will have a set of values. They will have a code of ethics. And I think that is the entry point for how you go about designing ethical systems, because these systems do not act in isolation. These systems are not working on their own. At Standard Chartered, one of our values is to do the right thing, and that drives a lot of our actions. In addition to this, you have jurisdictional, contextual do's and don'ts. The example you gave about the Philippines data privacy updates yesterday, I think that's a good example. So you take those as inputs, you frame your own set of ethical principles for developing systems. When it comes to inputs, data, for example, what we have at Standard Chartered, I've already described representativeness. So if you're targeting, say, retail customers in a particular country, does it reflect the racial composition of the country? For example, a Singapore or a Hong Kong, which are multicultural countries. If you're training a facial recognition algorithm, do you have sufficient representation of the various ethnicities or genders for that matter? Do you have sufficient training data of sufficient history, 6 months, 12 months, whatever that it warrants? So these are some of the considerations: your values, your code of ethics, local laws, regulations, as well as the particular use case that you're targeting, which go into assessing whether your AI system will be ethical enough.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Vijay. It suggests that this really speaks right to the core of the governance of any institution or organization. It's not something that the tech guys are worrying about. You've mentioned that it needs to be part of the actual ethical framework of the company. It has to be in the values of the company. It has to be in the operating principles of the company, and then it needs to work its way through the corporate governance structures into the daily decisions that are being made by the business unit managers, by the engineers as well. Do I have that right?
That's right. And you also have a governance process post the development of the system, which ensures that a wide variety of stakeholders, not just the business owners or the developers, but risk, compliance, truly multidisciplinary engagement is involved before it actually hits the production run. So it's about getting a diverse set of inputs and people kicking the tires depending on how material your AI system is, and ensuring that it's ethically sound.
So how does one, for example, at your bank, how does one put in sort of the checks and balances around that? Are checks and balances that have historically in place sufficient, or do they need to be revisited, in this new context of AI?
Good question. We had to revisit it. While we have always had ethical principles in business as well as ethical considerations in what we do, AI operates at a scale which is new. And we built on top of what we already have within the bank. We have existing frameworks. We have the model risk policies, for example. We have enough checks around, say, reputational risk and financial risk. We have an operational risk framework. So we brought all these together with the various risk and compliance teams, built on top of that and established a governance framework.
Yeah, excellent. And so if I can shift to a slightly different question now, when I think about AI in terms of where it's finding its way into our daily lives, certainly finance and banking comes forefront to mind. And indeed, this announcement yesterday by our National Privacy Commission that we've referred to. Another one I often comes to mind is healthcare. There's a lot of AI systems working their way, and certainly that's vitally important that people get the proper treatment. Is it really mostly in these areas that we're seeing AI and the ethical issues of AI crop up, or how broad is this? What is sort of the scope across the verticals?
Yeah, I think let me turn that question a bit, Colin. Let's step back. AI is being used across pretty much any vertical today. So healthcare, as you pointed out, there's a lot of work happening there. A lot of the work related to the COVID vaccine was also driven by AI, and some fantastic work happening in terms of supporting doctors with diagnosis. So, and healthcare is a critical area, life and death kind of area. Financial services, as you mentioned. Transportation, there is a lot of work happening in AI there. Telecommunications. So it is not about the vertical alone. It's also about the impact of AI on real world people. And I think that's where we need to twist the question. The ethical considerations are paramount where the impact on people is high. So healthcare, absolutely life and death situation. If you look at the United States of America, AI is used in the criminal justice system to decide on whether people get bail, parole, and so on. Again, a lot of ethical concerns to be factored when you use AI in those kind of areas. So rather than look at verticals, I look at the use cases for AI in each of those verticals. So if you're in, say, telecommunications and you're using AI for recruitment, I'd say it is very material, it's very important. So what we have at our bank is an impact assessment of each AI usage. What is the kind of impact it has on natural persons, maybe staff, maybe people? If that is high, then the kind of scrutiny it goes through from an ethical perspective is very different from if you're just going to look at log files and assess whether a particular error message is critical or not critical. So it's a materiality-based one. The incidence of materiality being high, a lot more common in healthcare and somewhat in financial services, maybe less so in other sectors. If you look at the air travel industry, I would say it would be very, very high. So it's very much dependent on the impact of the use case.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's very instructive for our audience to think about it in those terms. What are those use cases? Indeed, there are many use cases that are common across different industries, and you have to sort of bring it down to that level if you're going to properly address this. So, yeah, I really think that's excellent. Could you explain a little bit about what are some of the ethical concerns or threats in terms of their nature? I mean, you've got sort of the inadvertent, issues where probably unintentionally biased data was fed in, but kind of give us where are the areas that we should be looking into for potential AI problems. I mean, ethical problems with AI.
Certainly, and I would say the biggest concern is what I would call systematic unjust bias or systematic unfair treatment to parts of the population. What those parts are is very difficult to figure out. It could be maybe a particular gender, maybe a particular group of people based on religion. So it is really about systematically disadvantaging certain segments of society. And that is the biggest ethical consideration. You don't want to cause harm to any part of society. Typically, the way we look at this is at a use case level. If things go wrong, which segments of the population are going to be impacted and what is the harm caused to them? Is there any justification for them to be disadvantaged? So these are some of the questions we ask in each use case. And these questions are in the form of a framework, and like we described previously, based upon our values, based upon the various rules and regulations we've drawn there. But to me, unfair treatment for segments of population is the biggest ethical concern. And what unfair is very contextual.
Yes, indeed. Vijay, can I ask you, sometimes, and I increasingly more see articles written and they use this term weaponization of AI.
Yes.
What is that all about? It sounds kind of threatening and dark.
It is, yeah. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps me awake at night, Colin, other than coffee, that is. See, previously, I mean, humans have always been biased, and that's, you can't escape from that. However, there's a difference between, say, a single credit officer who is biased, rejecting 10 loan applications from women in a day, as opposed to an AI system which can scale that up and reject thousands of loan applications a day. That is weaponization of bias. The scale at which AI can perform and the volumes of people it can impact in a very short period of time is what we mean by weaponization. Don't get me wrong, AI can do wonderful things and it is demonstrated to be doing wonderful things. But in the right context, we need to watch out that it gets the right ingredients and we have the right outcomes from an ethical perspective as well.
Well, yeah, so true what you're saying. I think we would be remiss then if we're talking about threats. There are public structures to protect us from threats. Those are regulatory environments and regulatory agencies. How does that coming into play? Of course, here we have the National Privacy Commission. It's not just about ethics and AI, it's about data privacy more generally. Can you just give us an update on where you see us today with the regulatory environment and what the trends are?
Yeah, the regulators just starting in this space. And when I talk of regulators, my focus is mainly the financial regulators. In this particular area, I would say the regulators in Asia are ahead of the curve. Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore was the first of the bat with the FEAT principles, as they are called: fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency in the use of AI. This was published in 2018. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority followed in 2019 with a similar set of principles, albeit more detailed. The Bank of England is working on something this year, and the US regulators also are working on something. There was a survey they ran. However, these regulations are not always binding, not yet at least, and they don't cover every possible use case. So that's where the need to have ethical principles comes in, because you cannot legislate for everything. It's a matter of doing the right thing. It goes beyond can we do it to should we do it. That's where ethical principles come in. In terms of legislation, GDPR was the first. It's privacy. However, there are clauses there that refer to automated decision making. And it's the kind of gold standard when it comes to privacy regulations, binding on AI as well, because of the clauses related to automated decisioning. Increasingly, we are seeing other jurisdictions emulate the GDPR and have similar regulations. The European Union themselves have published the regulation for AI in April this year, which is, I think, going to be the same, have the same effect as the GDPR did for privacy, including eye-wateringly high penalties of up to 6% if your AI gets it wrong. So I think the regulators are starting to notice and act upon this space, and there'll be more action. Until then, we need to have our ethical principles in place so that we do right by our stakeholders and customers.
And what's the process by which these ethical principles are arising and becoming, accepted? Are these happening at national levels, international levels? How do they find their way, into acceptance?
I think it's happening at all levels, but most importantly, what I see is it is happening at an individual level. If you see the next generation of customers and stakeholders, the millennials, for example, these are people who are increasingly privacy aware, and they are very demanding and have high expectations around algorithmic transparency. And they will not take no for an answer. They will vote with their feet. They will vote with their wallet. So it is not a nice to have about using AI ethically anymore. It is a must. And going forward, if you have to survive, especially with, I'm sure sooner or later, algorithmic transparency will be part of your ESG ratings. So I don't think it will be a nice to have. It is a must. And if companies have to survive, they have to play ethically. So it comes together at that stage. Efforts underway to harmonize these kind of principles at a national and international level. But I think it's the individuals that will make a difference here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important that we have these dialogues. This is a very rapidly changing topic. It's important that there's communication, that there's openness and transparency, that we deal with this head on, both individually, companies, but also at the societal levels. Our time is going so quickly. We literally just have about a minute. Maybe I could just ask you to sort of sum up the key points, takeaways. What would you advise our audience to do? What steps should they take?
Yes, I think the key points I would like you to take away. One, ethical AI is not a nice to have. It's an absolute essential if the companies have to survive. Two, it cannot be done in silos. It cannot be done in isolation. You need multidisciplinary teams. You need participation across your businesses, across your risk and compliance, across diverse sets of people in order to ensure you have fair outcomes from using AI. And it is not just about the outcomes. Your inputs, your data must also be reliable and representative of the people that you're trying to serve. Otherwise, you're not going to get ideal results. So I think those would be my three takeaways for the session.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Vijay. I've learned a lot just in this short conversation. I'm glad we've had this opportunity to have the stage to bring this important topic into the conversation. So, Bhavana, I think that will wrap it up from our end.
Thank you so much, Colin and Vijay. What an excellent conversation. You're totally hooked to the screen and definitely, loved every bit of what all you spoke. So thank you once again for that great conversation.